When I was a child, one of my favorite games was The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Anyone who's played it can probably figure out why. Even if they don't particularly find it their favorite, naturally, as a very popular game, it spawned on rumors and legends, especially back in the day when communication through the internet wasn't as common. Most of these legends are false, but sometimes a surprising amount of truth can be found in them. A while ago, I had read an article about the early versions of Zelda's 3D. It was called in development, and apparently these early versions were incredibly different from the released versions. It was modeled after the original Legend of Zelda rather than a link to the past, as such as a lot more roam-freeing and adventurous than the one we got. At the time it sounded awesome, and I even found myself wondering why they had abandoned the project. I concluded it was probably due to the technical requirements of such a feat. Still, one thing that especially stuck with me were the pictures. Some were nondescript, nothing special, but one showed a large expanse of desert environment. There was a palm tree and a small oasis near such much more primitive looking link, as well as some enemies. Past that, however, it was just sand, stretching to the horizon. The thoughts of that might lay beyond the desert seemed to stick the image in my head. After that, we skipped several years later. The article was only a vague recollection of nothing important. I was hanging out at the local games shop with one of my friends. He's telling me about this day and tells me how a guy came in to sell his old missing son's video games. He showed me them and they were all normal games. A few Wii games, a few GameCube games, and a lot of Nintendo 64 games. Still, the only one that really caught my eye was a red cartridge with no label, except a piece of tape with the words Zelda written on it in marker. Naturally, this got me curious. My friend didn't share my curiosity, but he didn't think he could sell the game and just let me take it home for free and indulge myself. Naturally, I did. The moment the game started, I realized it wasn't the Zelda I was used to. The title screen was nothing but a nondescript The Legend of Zelda, no subtitles, no fancy font, no music, just those words in black bordered lettering. The background wasn't from 002 or either. It was an overhead view of what could only be called as ancient ruins. They looked very sinister and grotesque, similar to something from Majora's Mask, only without a hint of the mystical atmosphere that accompanied any Zelda game. They were simply unnerving. Still, this didn't stop my curiosity. It only kept me going. As soon as I press start, the game begins. It skips over any file screens and dumps a blocky-looking link into an empty black environment. And when I say black, I mean black. There's nothing separating the ground and sky, just blackness. The only thing that let me notice is that the game even worked was a temple in the distance, similar to the one in the opening. Moving still seemed to work fine, suggesting that something probably glitched with the textures of the ground and sky. Still, it seemed strange and nothing has happened to the other textures. Entering the temple was my only choice, so I took it. The one thing is worth mentioning is that the game started with no music. That just definitely silence. However, the closer you came to the temple, the more the music was available to hear. Well, it wasn't really music. It sounded like moaning, similar to the re-deads in Ocarina of Time, but the more tiny and badly recorded. Every once in a while, some sobs can be heard, but they were quickly stifled. Entering the temple made everything seem more like a Zelda game, but something really caught my eye. Rather than the textures being worse than those in Ocarina of Time, they were better. They were in more detail in everything, but that was all dingy and rotten looking. Extra polygons only served to make things look more grotesque. The random blood splatters didn't help anything either. It didn't take long for me to realize that the entire dungeon could hardly be called a Zelda-like puzzles, usually consist of pulling a lever or pressing a switch. In fact, there wasn't even any sliding blocks. There were no enemies either, but the blood splatters on the walls were served to be warnings of booby traps. Some became inescapable, and simply send you back to the darknesses again. Others were inescapable, but still extremely creepy and depressing. The dungeon was riddled with the low poly remains of dead adventures, and sometimes they even had items on them. The items would be picked up, but the inventory screen seemed unfinished, and the game only auto-equipped for the first 3 items packed up since there was no accessible inventory screen. After several gruesome deaths and retries, I found my way to a door marked with a scratched-on eye, similar to the one's lens of truth and various other objects. Entering this door revealed a boss battle. The music by this point had changed, and I only had recognized it by the last room. The moaning had never looped once, but still it seemed to change according to the mood. A disco-rand violin melody started playing, but the rest of the sound remained nothing but moans, sobs, yells, and weird scratching. It was never enough to rise past the level of background noise, but it still remained unnerving, almost as if it wasn't music at all, but monsters that were wandering somewhere in the temple. When I said entering the room and revealed a boss battle, I was not entirely honest. It could only be called a boss battle by the most generous standards. It featured an empty room with the same textures on the walls as the rest of the temple. The only out-of-place aspect was the giant face on the other side of the room, colored as gray as the walls surrounding it. Its skin seemed stretched over its head and lined with the wall, so it looked like as the wall was growing a face. Moss seemed to be growing over its closed eyes, and cracks were apparent everywhere on it. Still, the door I came in was locked, and the only thing I tried to do was to approach. I did so carefully, making sure nothing was waiting for a surprise attack. I went up to the point where I was nearly in contact with their face. Nothing, it was still there, with its sunken eyes and cracked lips. I attacked it with my sword. The sword went through and made an incredibly vulgar flesh-ripping sound, but nothing happened. It remained there, and I attacked some more, and still more, until eventually the music stopped. Soon the counterpoint of the violin music became even louder, and then the moans started up even stronger. And then something happened. In one movement, its eyes opened, staring at me with dry, soulless eyeballs, and then nothing. The music was still louder, but I continued to attack the face with no reaction, until it simply had enough, ripped to shreds, and fell away in the fire, in typical Zelda fashion, revealing a door. The music had stopped. There were no more moans or screams or anything. I just went for the door. What a fool I was. That was the only tutorial. The screen was replaced with a white screen, followed by a moment of extremely loud brown and noise. I jumped, but it was almost over instantly. The white screen was replaced by endless desert. The one from the image, I was shocked. By that point, I was crept out enough to turn the game off. Still, that respite that didn't last long, as I had nightmares of the game. Normal nightmares. Nothing weird about them. It was, after all, a pretty creepy game. However, that frightened me the most was something I skimmed over while I played and realized afterwards. The game changed each time I start over. When I tried to make the same path through the labyrinth, I always ended up lost and confused. By the time I finished, I was relying on instinct. I just kept going the next day, stopping only to eat and go to the bathroom. When I turned it on, I was still at the desert, even though there was no file screen. This time it was night. I walked. Sometimes I would walk for 20 minutes, only to find a half-sunken obelisk, or the ruins of what looked like some village hut. Other times there would be a skull or a few bones, but nothing more noticeable than that. Other times I would see great expanses of oases and tropical forests. I found my first enemies here. They were similar to the Techites, but only with the larger bodies, mostly containing their large eye. They had thin, long legs and would still attack by leaping. Only then they hit you. They would pin you to the ground and attack. Soon the sun rose and I continued walking. Sometimes I would find small tombs. These were almost always similar in style to the first dungeon, only without the moaning and no bosses. What I did find in this information, runes scribbled onto the walls that could be read. The description almost always to be vague with the phrases like, and knowledge is shall guide way to heavens. Sometimes they would be followed by other comments, but most writings seemed glitched and unintelligible. It seemed to be a history, though. The maps I'd sometimes found confirmed it. I simply explored, and after a while, I learned to let the instinct guide my way. Soon I find the next dungeon, a large pyramid rising out of the desert, upside down, over it, straight up into the sky. It was another large upside down temple. It stretched so far that I couldn't see the top, but I couldn't keep going. I needed to sleep again. The next day came, and I entered the dungeon. It was all like small tombs that I would find, only a bit more perilous. More bottomless pits, chasms, spike traps, and monsters this time. Long arms that would grab you from out of the wall like wall masters. Only these simply threw you into the traps, killing you. What probably used to be deads, and skeletons. At the end of this dungeon, I found a large spiral staircase. I followed it up and up until I reached what seemed to be the top. It took 2 hours of climbing, but the time seemed to fly by. The top was merely a platform with a large ornate arrow pointing off in an edge. Since there was nowhere else to go, I jumped. The screen flashed again white, and I was in a new area. This went on for a few weeks. There were many places to visit. At times I could find the borders where once the local met another. I started to name the locations I had been to, but although I started knowing all the places immediately, there was never seemed to be an end to these new locations. Sometimes I would go through one door and come out the other door at the end of the world. Places didn't behave my constant rules of space, but it became easier to find my way regardless. Each time I revisit a place, it was rearranged in a different, more negative setup. From every corner, though, I could see the tower in the distance. I quickly realized I had not reached the top, only fallen into one of the many traps. In fact, I still haven't reached the top. In the few times I went about in the real world, and I could feel about that game was different. It changed itself. It seemed to react to me. I was sure that a game like this should have not been able to be created, but then they were going to a free roaming experience more similar to the original Zelda. What if they succeeded? They created a world who could always roam, and they really did create a world. I had learned from many gods in that land. There are free goddesses who had created such a perverted physical world. The god who sees, who decides to cleanse it. I still don't know my own route, but I still felt like if I simply followed my instincts, I could find my goal. That's why I'm writing this now. My instincts still tell me where to go, but it's not here. It's not in the game. I have to leave, and I will do it. But before I go, I feel I have to leave this message for someone to find. I should warn you though, it may be a game, but it knows you are what you are playing.
What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Ms. Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, please stay pretty.